President Trump announcing that Boeing will build the Air Force's future fighter jet. It's being named the F-47.
Boeing a $20 billion contract to manufacture and engineer the world's first sixth-generation fighter jet. It will be known as the F-47.
China is today not only a giant player in world trade, but also holds the potential to shift the geopolitical balance thanks to the rare earth trump card hidden at the heart of modern defense and technology. On the one hand, there are 17 elements that are hidden from view, but play a critical role in everything from smartphones and electric vehicles to missile guidance systems and nuclear submarines. On the other, there is China, which produces an overwhelming 90% of these elements. Without access to these resources for defense projects or next-generation technological breakthroughs, even the world's great economic powers may be unable to move forward. Aware of this fact, the United States, for its part, has been loudly voicing its concern. Will our defense industry collapse if rare earths slip out of our hands? The recent escalation of tariffs, diplomatic confrontations and uncertainties arising from military projects are all crystallizing around this axis. Although the term rare earth elements is one we don't often hear, in reality it encompasses 17 elements: lanthanum, cerium, praseodymium, neodymium, promethium, samarium, europium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, holmium, erbium, thulium, ytterbium, lutetium, scandium and yttrium. They all have different chemical properties, but what they have in common is that they are indispensable in a wide range of applications, from defense and medical devices to laser systems and wind turbines. China's manufacturing superiority in this area has always been seen as a fragile dependency for the Western world. Defense companies have to import these materials for components such as alloys resistant to high-temperature environments or magnets needed for missile guidance. In an increasingly complex technology ecosystem, elements such as tungsten, tellurium, bismuth, molybdenum and indium are also crucial. Tungsten, with its extremely hard structure, is used for armor-piercing bullets, high-strength alloys and rocket nozzles, while tellurium is used in semiconductors and solar panels. Bismuth can be used in environmentally friendly bullets that replace lead or in sensors. Molybdenum provides heat resistance in aircraft engines, while indium is key in many fields, from touchscreens to high-frequency circuits. China's refining and production share in almost all of the elements in this list is at very high levels. Some sources say at least 80% of the US military's modern weapons cannot be produced without rare earths and strategic metals produced in China or refined in Chinese refineries. The demand for rare earths, which are used in the defense industry to make magnets such as neodymium and dysprosium, especially in rocket and missile systems, is increasing every year. Likewise, the US Air Force's next-generation aircraft engines depend on these elements for heat and magnetic resistance. The United States has been a defense technology leader since the mid-20th century, but this vulnerability means that even a single Chinese move to restrict exports could have a domino effect. When rare earths, the small but critical component in strategic aircraft and missiles, are missing, the entire chain risks coming to a halt. While US administrations have long questioned why we cannot exploit our own reserves, deposits in some states cannot be used efficiently due to environmental barriers, high costs, or insufficient refining capacity. At the same time, some mining projects in countries such as Australia or Canada are trying to get off the ground, but catching up with China is not so easy. It is not enough just to extract the ore. Refining and separation processes are as complex as mining. China has been investing heavily in this area for decades, turning the partial withdrawal of Europe and the US from this sector into an opportunity. As a result, Beijing has increased its share of the world market to more than 90% and has become unrivaled. During his presidency, Donald Trump sought to put pressure on China in the trade arena by imposing heavy tariffs. His claim was that we would divert US imports away from China and create jobs by returning to our own production. But Beijing's rare earth strategy stands in the way. As Trump's trade policy has hardened, China has hinted that we won't sell critical raw materials if we want to. While both sides are sending a message to the public that we will be the winners, global experts emphasize the fragility of US defense projects the most. On the one hand, existing weapons systems such as the F-35 and Patriot. On the other hand, the F-47 project, which is still in the prototype stage, or future hypersonic missiles. All are dependent on small metal and alloy components. If these pass through the Chinese refining chain, Beijing, which has said we will stop production, could disrupt these projects. The F-47 fighter jet has become a symbol of this fragility. Looking at the design details, a significant part of the stealth feature is again based on rare earth derivative coatings and heat-resistant alloys. The moment China says, "I'm not supplying this material," the US's most ambitious next-generation aircraft project could be shelved or condemned to much more expensive and lengthy research. Some have said, let's get it from Europe or Australia. But due to the lack of capacity and refining facilities, this route may only work in the medium to long term. It is unlikely that the US military will be able to deploy this alternative in the short term. In addition, it is known that the electric vehicle, energy and electronics industries are also deeply dependent on these 17 critical elements. Coincidentally, alloys such as tungsten and molybdenum are frequently used in electric vehicle engines. China also has a huge share of the electric vehicle market. If Beijing says cut exports, US or European manufacturers will find it difficult to produce engine parts. This would be a major crisis in the civilian sector as well as missile engines. So the US government, perhaps under the guise of defense, wants to protect civilian manufacturers as well. But contrary to expectations, Trump's trade moves may lead Beijing not to diplomatic compromise, but to more decisive retaliation. This is where the Greenland issue comes into play. The melting ice of the Arctic may open the door to many strategic minerals. Greenland is one of the places mentioned as an alternative source in this context. However, the Trump administration's harsh and undiplomatic outbursts, such as "would we buy Greenland?" have disturbed both Denmark and the local government of Greenland. And yet, instead of making reasonable deals there, the US has caused tensions. If China chooses the path of "we will make more polite, long-term investment agreements with Greenland," the US may lose this alternative as well. Because Greenland's leadership might think, we have economic interest on the road to independence, and Beijing's investments could offer a good opportunity. Thus, the US would be shooting itself in the foot in its plan to break China's rare earth monopoly. The economic dimension adds another dynamic. The tougher Trump's tariffs get, the more China is creating options for the US economy. The American agricultural, technology, and automotive sectors cannot afford to lose the Chinese market. Therefore, in addition to the rare earths issue, Beijing could also close the doors to US exporters. As the US economy is already entering a costly period due to tariffs, China's retaliation could increase inflation and job losses. American voters and the business community could then react to the administration by saying, "Why are we getting so tough? Can't we just compromise?" Beijing would have the upper hand at the diplomatic table, saying, "Let's compromise, but first you make concessions to us." In the next stage of this cycle, the US may be forced to say, "Okay, let's withdraw the tariffs, but don't limit rare element exports." When both military and economic dilemmas overlap like this, defense experts say, if the US defense industry cannot resolve its dependence on these sensitive materials, it will be at a great disadvantage in potential future conflicts. This is because new missile guides, stealth coatings, laser systems, and even space-based defense satellites use special alloys of these elements. Tungsten's extreme hardness and high melting point, molybdenum's heat resistance, tellurium, and bismuth's special semiconductor properties, neodymium, and dysprosium's magnetic strength. The list goes on. China holds the key to every step on this list. The process also has political repercussions. In US domestic politics, Trump's steps are criticized as short-term populism. In particular, despite the thesis that we are protecting our own producers, it is known that aviation giants such as Boeing and defense companies such as General Dynamics are complaining, how will we maintain the flow of materials? Likewise, automotive giants such as Ford and GM may face problems in the supply of critical metals for their electric vehicle plans. In the midst of these tensions, Beijing is whispering the message, "If you push my interests, I'll pull your socks up." Could rare earth restrictions destroy the US defense industry? Is not just a nightmare, but a very concrete scenario. The Chinese side is also aware of this trump card. It had previously imposed a similar export restriction in the 2010s, raising fears of shortages in the world market. At the time, the US and Japan scrambled to find substitute suppliers, but the results were limited. This is because it takes years, billions of dollars of investment, and difficult environmental approvals to build refining plants. China, on the other hand, has invested in this sector for decades, gaining technological experience and being more flexible in environmental regulations. The result, Beijing can make a small announcement at any time, sending prices skyrocketing and putting US defense projects in a deadlock. This is precisely where an economy that combines technological progress and resource control puts its competitors under pressure. So how will the future take shape? Perhaps the US will try to accelerate mining projects in Australia, Canada, or Africa, perhaps through diplomacy and stimulus packages. In Greenland, if it develops a new approach and reaches reasonable agreements with Denmark and the local government, it could unlock the potential there. But all this requires time, money, and political will. It is not realistic to say in the near term we have created an alternative to Chinese rare earths. We don't need them anymore. In the meantime, Beijing will watch the US moves and, if necessary, cut exports and say, look, you can't escape that easily. This cat and mouse game will continue, perhaps for decades. This picture points to delays, cost increases, and even cancellations in projects such as the US F-47 Dream. If a single part is missing, the entire production line stops. Industry insiders remind us. Everything from the inner lining of supersonic engines to the indium components used in the special cockpit displays is critically dependent. Therefore, the statement, China strikes a blow to Donald Trump's F-47 fighter jet dream, is not an exaggeration, but a potential reality. So, what can Trump put into action as a plan B? The answer is unknown. This is because the US domestic procurement capacity is not in a position to close the gap in such a short period of time. This shows how global and interdependent modern military competition is. In fact, a reflection of this issue revolves around the question, if the US state were to open a rare earth refinery domestically, how would we overcome environmental permits, activist groups, and high-cost obstacles? Although the press occasionally floats the idea of giant state-sponsored refineries, it is not easy for projects to move forward quickly. On the other hand, Beijing maintains its market dominance by saying, I have already optimized this business and sell it to the world. According to trade statistics, about 90% of global rare earths originate from China. Moreover, China dominates the refining market in separate categories such as tungsten, tellurium, bismuth, molybdenum, and indium. Therefore, the question, how will the US defense industry satisfy its hunger for these materials, turns into the question, what will we be left with as we escalate tensions with China? In all this complexity, China's options for the US economy as the impact of Trump's tariffs escalates contains more strategic moves. Beijing could impose tariffs or export restrictions targeting different sectors of the US economy. Meanwhile, there are options to fill in the gaps and undermine US plans in areas such as Greenland. Trump, who has called for domestic production in defense and space, is perhaps unwittingly putting the brakes on his own dreams due to the lack of rare earth elements. If instead of such aggressive tariffs, the US had negotiated more rationally, perhaps the US could have struck some kind of deal with China and secured the uninterrupted flow of raw materials needed for defense projects, experts say. No matter how we look at it, the conclusion is this. With China's share of production of critical metals such as rare earth elements, tungsten, tellurium, bismuth, molybdenum, and indium so high, the US defense industry may find it difficult to maintain its claim to be the world leader. Yes, the US has huge technology companies, but even those companies cannot run an assembly line without basic raw materials. The F-47 or similar projects may remain a great dream. If the diplomatic bridges with Greenland are thrown away, the US will be helpless until it develops either Australia, Canada, or Africa. But this would mean a gap of at least 5 to 10 years, given China's already almost 15 to 20 year backlog. With modern defense technologies making new strides in the race every year, such a gap could seriously set the US back. In the end, there is no clear answer to the question, who will win? The US, which wants to build giant projects in fighter jets, nuclear submarines, missile systems, and cyberspace, knows that it cannot move forward unless it solves the raw material supply problem. China, on the other hand, realizes that it can use bullying or rare earth weapons to pressure not only the US, but the entire West. Trump's willingness to exert harsh pressure through tariffs may be pushing Beijing to play this card. Greenland was a gateway to alternative minds, but if it too is closed by diplomatic disasters, the picture becomes more striking. If the tensions that started with the trade war turn into a lockdown on vital elements of the defense industry, the geopolitical weight of the US could be shaken. This great rivalry, erupting in the shadow of rare earths, will perhaps define the world order in the first half of the 21st century. Because if the US does not find a way out of its predicament, it could face a weakness that would undermine its perception as a global superpower. China seems to be planning to take advantage of this critical moment for its own growth. Stay tuned and stay tuned to this critical agenda.